Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. I'm willing to bet most of you listening to this haven't heard of Saunders Lewis. Lewis was a prominent Welsh language writer and the founder of Plaid Cymru, the party of Welsh nationalism. Unlike Scotland, Wales has not been an independent country for over 700 years, and though Welsh independence does not have anything approaching majority support in Wales, the nationalist cause which Saunders Lewis helped create has been successful in engineering a revival of the Welsh language. Today, Plaid Cymru is a broadly centre-left political party. This is interesting because Lewis's own politics was fairly conservative. His vision of an independent Welsh nation was one of a country dedicated to rural culture, preservation of language, and upholding of Christian values through Catholicism, the religion Wales had before its gradual incorporation into England. Lewis's reactionary and anti-socialist stances led him to fall out with many Welsh political leaders, and even to espouse support for fascist thought and thinkers in the 1930s. He was also sent to prison in 1937 after setting fire to a construction site in North Wales where a British military training camp was due to be built, something Lewis found an affront to Welsh autonomy. My guest for this discussion is T Robin Chapman. Robin is a senior lecturer in the Department of Welsh and Celtic Studies at the University of Aberystwyth and has written many books about Welsh politics and literature, including The Oxford Literary History of Wales, released in 2020. As well as discussing the pivotal moments in Saunders Lewis's life, we discuss the strained relationship between the socialist and nationalist movements in Wales, why North and South Wales are so different, and where the prospects for an independent Wales stand today. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Saunders Lewis. Hi Robin, how are you?
Hi, very well, thanks Tom.
Great. Robin, Saunders Lewis is, for my money, the most obscure person I've examined on this podcast so far. He never held public office. He's probably better remembered as a writer than as a political activist, certainly in Wales. You've written a book about Saunders Lewis. What story do you want, or did you want to tell about him when you were writing it? And just briefly, why do you find his legacy interesting?
Okay, I suppose what motivated me to write it was that there'd always been a gap. An awful lot of people had said, Saunders Lewis needs a biography. His story intersects with so many other people that it was almost as though there was a void at the centre of Welsh cultural and political life for most of the 20th century. And so I suppose my intention was to go to the middle of that web and try to put the story together with him at the centre, because I think he occupies a curious place in Welsh cultural life. Always an outsider, always more revered or hated than held with any affection. The hated and the dead, I think an awful lot of people would concur with that verdict on him. So the story needed to be told as much for the role that I hope the book would play in the cultural and political history of the 20th century as much as being his own story.
Welsh nationalism and cultural history is certainly a very wide web and not, I don't think, a particularly easy one to grasp. If we talk about Lewis's early life, he was born in 1893 in England. Actually, he was born in Cheshire. He went on to become, as you said, an important figure in Welsh life and specifically in literature. Was his upbringing bookish, from what we know?
Certainly was. Son of the manse. His father was almost Calvinistic Methodist royalty in Cheshire. Father, a preacher, of course, a biographer in his own right, wrote poetry, supported the anti-slavery cause. Quite given, unusual for the time, particularly in Calvinistic Methodism, quite given to preaching a social gospel. And so, yes, privately educated, and went from his private school out on the Wirral to Liverpool University to read English. So a fairly conventional upbringing. The only direct connection he had with Wales was the occasional visit during the summer to see his family either down in South Wales in Carmarthenshire or over in Anglesey. And it would not have been a surprise had he not pursued that Welsh side of himself. I don't think there was an awful lot of exploration of his own Welshness and sense of vocation as a Welshman at all in his early life. He was the classic minor public school boy. Wrote his bits of verse for the school magazine, played on the right wing for the school football team, was destined for a career possibly as an academic in English literature.
It's quite interesting that you say that, given the character that he went on to become, who was so besotted with the idea of Welshness in his later life. I mean, like so many people of his age, his kind of formative years were shaped and overshadowed by the First World War. He was 21 in 1914. And he enlisted in the army, in the British Army, almost as soon as the war broke out. What effect did fighting in France have on Lewis? And did it have... I'm interested to see where this kind of explosion of Welsh personal identity came from. Was it during the war?
I think it was, yeah. He took a commission with the South Wales Borders, went out, was wounded, and invalided out. But it was when he was in the trenches that he began to read writers on the French right, Barret, Marat, these people, and was drawn, I think, initially to an interest in outsiders per se. I don't necessarily think that there was a total attraction to the right as such. I think there was an attraction to being contrarian, to being shocking. And I think that's what motivated him initially. So he became quite outspoken about his own upbringing. He talked about the plebeian pomposity of nonconformism, for example. He described very early on the nonconformists praying in the chapel, not going on their knees as they should, but leaning forward in their chairs, rather as if they're vomiting, he writes. And there's an odd desire to be on the outside, to define himself in opposition almost to everything. And I think that was possibly the legacy of the war. Because he came out not in any way disenchanted with what he'd seen. It wasn't a Wilfred Owen or Siegfried Sassoon moment. There was no patriotism followed by disillusionment. He seemed hardly to have been affected by it at all. I mean, it left a huge physical scar on him, but it was not something to which he referred back. The only thing he ever said was that he considered the soldier's life to be a noble one. But it didn't appear to be a turning point. It wasn't a focus for his action thereafter.
As you said, he'd grown up as a Methodist, and Methodism has a significant history in Wales. But as you've said, he began to become contemptuous of that particular strand of nonconformist Protestantism, and he converted to Catholicism after the war. Why did he do that, and was it an important step in his view of Welsh nationalism?
Indeed it was, yeah. And I think these two things ran in parallel. I don't think we can talk about one as being an influence on the other. I think they eventually converged. So to begin with, the Catholicism, reading the work of people in Action Française and so on, I think alerted him to the idea that a religious faith could have a political iteration. And he was drawn, I think, to the idea of, as so many Catholic converts are, to the ritual of it all. I think he saw it almost as the antithesis of the plain nonconformist chapel. He was quite taken by the mysterium tremendum and so on, and the idea of a spiritual life that was divorced from social concerns. Alongside that, you get that first stirrings of nationalism. And again, I think, just in the same way that his conversion was a contrary act, I think his espousal of a particular brand of nationalism, I'm sure we'll have more to discuss on that, again was contrarian. Because there were an awful lot of people in the first 2 decades of the 20th century who would have called themselves nationalists without feeling the need for any political affiliation as a nationalist party. Civic nationalism, if you like, very popular among liberals before the First World War and for a few years thereafter, looking at nationalism as being a gradual development of trappings of national culture and, by extension, of a national character. So huge numbers of institutions were created at the turn of the 20th century before there was any talk of a Welsh nationalist party. So you've got the University of Wales gets its charter 1893 as a national library, 1909 National Theatre Company, 1911, moving on, National Museum. And central to that, I think, was disestablishment finally achieved in 1920, which had come from nonconformist campaigns to not to be represented by the Church of England. And the Church in Wales comes about in 1920. And all these things seem to converge piecemeal to create a Welsh identity. But again, as a contrarian, Saunders Lewis doesn't see his role as adding to those civic trappings. He looks more for a continuity of culture with Europe rather than set in opposition to the English state.
I think there's one other thing which we should mention just to perhaps give it a bit more of an overall perspective, which is obviously for people listening abroad who aren't necessarily that familiar with Wales, is that Wales is or has a significant language of its own, which is still spoken by large parts of the population. When Lewis was going on his conversion, if you want to call it that, towards nationalism, quite an idiosyncratic form of nationalism that he had, he obviously set up Plaid Cymru in the mid-1920s. For those, again, listening who don't know much about Wales, Plaid Cymru is still the main Welsh nationalist political party today. How important was the Welsh language for Lewis's own conception of Welsh nationalism?
Absolutely central. There are 2 words in Welsh, and I won't bother you with the words themselves, but there's one letter difference between them. One means injustice, and the other means incompleteness. And he'd often play with those 2 words and say, it isn't the injustice that Wales has suffered that motivates me. It's the incompleteness. It's the fact that the decline in the language means that we are being severed from our past. And his nationalism was to restore that completeness, not to right any perceived wrongs. He wasn't particularly attracted by the Irish model of nationalism, for example. He wasn't particularly drawn to Sinn Féin and so on. He saw that Ireland had already, because of losing its language, the vast part of the country, that Ireland didn't have anything to teach Wales. The language is a means of cultural continuity. That was what he was hoping to achieve. I think that was what drove him. And he was interested then in Catholicism as part of that completeness. Wales was once wholly Welsh-speaking and a Catholic country before the Act of Union, 1536. That is what Wales should be, Welsh-speaking and ideally Catholic. I think he was aware enough to know that this was almost impossible, but that didn't deter him.
So in some ways, you might draw a comparison with, for example, Poland in the Russian Empire, trying to remain Catholic in order to stave off orthodoxy from the East.
That'd be a fair comparison, I think. I don't want to imply that there was any cynicism in his espousal of Catholicism. I think that was met a genuine spiritual need, but he was aware too that religion had cultural significance. It was something more than the relationship between man and God. It was part of the makeup of a nation.
Sure. It's quite interesting because all of the elements of nationalism that we've talked about so far, Robin, are basically, to use your word, they're expressions of kind of civic nationalism. But there's not, I get the impression at least that Lewis, if you compare him to somebody like, I'm trying to think of a politician, a contemporary of his in politics, perhaps somebody like Keir Hardie, rough contemporary. Hardie's analysis was very much based in obviously politics as a way of changing people's lives and economics, and specifically economics of the left. Can you describe a bit, what do you think Lewis's political ideology was like? Did he really have one? Was he essentially just interested in acting like a contrarian and perhaps not really nailing down his political opinions? Please.
I think it was a bit of a hodgepodge, not just because there was a contrarian instinct in him. I think that it appears, as I was putting the biography together, that it's something that almost surprised him as it came together. So, for example, 1934, he's recommending readers of his nationalist newspaper to read James Strachey Barnes's Fascism in the Home University Library series. But he draws back from espousing fascism completely, he says, because although he likes the motivation behind it, the idea of the strong leader, the sense of duty, he doesn't like the means by which it's being achieved, and he doesn't like the statism that's involved in, say, Italian fascism at the time, and the links with militarism. So it's a piecemeal political philosophy. It could be interpreted, if you like, as being willfully contrarian. What I think it is more is that things occur to him. He's often very candid about saying, it's just struck me that this could have a role. So, for example, fascism he's interested in a rather selective way. He's interested also in the cooperative movement. He's interested in guilds. He's interested in credit unions. Anything that distinguishes his politics from the left's emphasis on the state and the right's emphasis on capitalism. Again, I think he's trying to map out a territory that's very much his own.
Yes, I suppose so. But even then, I mean, that kind of attempt to triangulate between socialism and capitalism does almost have a sort of fascist air about it, even if you put it in that fairly that fairly simplistic dichotomy, I think, because that's very much, I think, the sort of justification that Mussolini gave for his own program.
Sure. He mentions Mussolini and is very taken with Mussolini's personal story. I suppose ideologically he'd be close to people like Belloc, Chesterton, that fascism with a gentle face, if you like. He's certainly not one for the grand displays. There's nothing in him that's drawn to the theatre of politics. That's not part of it. I think he just likes the idea of people defining themselves by allegiance to a particular authority, and he finds that in the Catholic Church, and he finds that in fascism's call for all people to work for the common good and so on, across class boundaries, across regional differences. But it's never tinged with militarism, it's never tinged with display, and it's certainly not statist in the sense of having a dictatorial regime. So the whole thing is pretty much of a ragabag of ideas. And set against that, of course, he's trying to persuade a country which defines itself by its non-conformism, which where you have that change at the turn immediately after the First War, where Wales goes from being predominantly a liberal country to being predominantly a socialist one. So he's in the wrong place at the wrong time to make a success of any of this. But I think he quite likes the challenge. It's as much an intellectual challenge as a political one.
Sure. I want to talk about, I certainly want to return to the issue of socialism in Wales as well, because I think it interacts with his story in quite an interesting way. I want to talk about the events of 1936 first, though. The UK government, led by Stanley Baldwin, a Tory Prime Minister, decided that year to build a training camp in North Wales, a military training camp on the Llyn Peninsula, which sort of stretches out into the Irish Sea. Lewis objected very strongly to this. What can you talk about? He called the training camp a bombing school. Yeah. Can you talk a bit about the bombing school story, because it's probably the most it's probably his biggest expression of his Welsh nationalism in his own quite odd way.
Indeed it is, yeah. Well, to begin with, I suppose that by 1936, and the year itself is significant, he's looking back to on the 400th anniversary of the Act of Union, and looking, I think, for a cause. He needs a focus. Welsh Nationalist Party had been established 10 years before, and so there's this sense of an anniversary looming. What can we say that we have achieved over those 10 years? How is Wales different today from what it was when we set the ball rolling in the mid-1920s? And he first, but I'll come on to this bombing school, as he called it, in a moment. But I think it's a measure of the man that the first cause that he espouses and hopes to make into a campaign is almost a laughable one. It's the decision of the local authority in a South Wales town called Neath to invite an agricultural show there in 1936, the Bath and West Show, which is people go and display there. They hold competitions where they show their animals. They show, the sort of thing. And Neath Council invites this show to Wales. It's not the first time that it's gone from Bath, and west, meaning the west of England, over the border into Wales. It had been held in Wales before. But Saunders Lewis, I think, driven by this idea of the 10th anniversary looming, driven by the 400th anniversary of the bombings, of the Act of Union, says this is where we're going to focus our attention. We're going to oppose this agricultural show coming to Wales. And he writes to say it is a major and important battle for us. This should be the focus. And starts to try and rally some sort of support about seeing this as an expression of English dominance and high-handedness. And it doesn't really work. I mean, he says it's rather like the Celts inviting Hengist and Horsa to Britain. It's a show of our inability to think for ourselves. And I think he does it too because there's a pressure on him in the press at the time where reporters are saying Welsh nationalism, I'm quoting from one columnist at the time, on the eve of this 10th anniversary, Welsh nationalism needs to do something uncompromising. And then, almost like manna from heaven, along comes the opportunity when the Air Ministry announces in 1935 that they're considering building a training facility for pilots. And they've approached various, they've looked at various sites. They've looked over in East Anglia, they've looked up in the northeast of England. And on both occasions, there's been a public outcry because they're thinking of siting this training facility where there are rare breed of ducks, or it's very close to the ruins of an abbey up in the northeast of England in Northumberland. And eventually they settle on this corner of northwest Wales. And speaking anonymously to the press, somebody is asked there what do they think of this idea of this training facility coming to North Wales, and says, as a Welsh nationalist, Mr. X, interviewed in the newspaper, says, we oppose it wholeheartedly and we will lay our bodies down on the road to prevent the building being constructed. First that Saunders Lewis knows about this is when he reads this interview. And immediately he springs into action and says, good, we've found our cause. And the opposition to this bombing school follows the expected pattern. There are petitions, there are public meetings and so on. And nothing much comes of it. It goes through Parliament, it's approved and so on. And so he decides to take a radical act, goes with a couple of colleagues, a Baptist minister and a school teacher. The three of them travel to North Wales from their homes in other parts of Wales, September 1936, and set fire to the workmen's huts where the site is about to be constructed. They then take themselves off to the local police station, hand themselves in, and say that they've done this as a deliberate act of arson against the English state. They've handed themselves over. They appear before the magistrates' court. It's handed on over then to the assizes in Carnarvon in autumn of 1936, and the jury fails to reach a verdict, and they're released. And then the intervenes and says, we need a retrial. And that trial will be held at the Old Bailey in London. And it's the first time that a case, it's completely unprecedented that a case is moved from Wales for retrial in England. And it's just what they want. And they are eventually tried in January 1937 and jailed for 9 months in Wormwood Scrubs, in the probably the largest prison in England at the time. And there they are from January through to August. They're released slightly early because they've behaved themselves while they're there. Saunders Lewis is stripped of his commission retrospectively as an army officer, spends some time in hospital while he's there, not a well man, and comes out, and there's a huge meeting to greet him, and he's found his cause, and basically addresses this huge meeting, 12,000 people in the pavilion in Carnarvon, and says that he has accepted the imposition and the imprisonment because you need leaders, he says. You cannot save a nation unless you have leaders who are ready to accept and face contempt, pain, illness, poverty and prison. In prison, or shortly after the trial is held, he's dismissed from his post. He's been an academic working as a lecturer in Swansea since 1922, and he finds himself unemployed and begins to cobble together a living by teaching extramural classes, by working in a school, and by a bit of journalism. So that's the context. That's the high watermark of his fame, if you like. The picture of them arriving at the Old Bailey for the trial is carried on the front page of the Times. So Welsh nationalism has arrived on the British scene, if you like.
Yeah. So overall, in terms of the intended effect that they wanted it to have, it was a roaring success then.
It became a cause célèbre. It drew attention to the nationalist cause. It led in the short term to an increase in party membership, but personally hugely costly, of course. And almost his first act on being released is to say, I wish to withdraw from the presidency. And eventually his party allows him to resign as president in 1939. Again, we're with this contrarianism somehow. And he basically cobbles together a living from various sources without any regular income until at the age of 58 he finds his way back into academia when he takes a lectureship in Cardiff in 1951. But in the meantime, and I suspect you're going to ask me about this, Tom, there's a famous by-election to be fought.
Yes, there is. 1943, yeah. If I'm correct. Uh-huh. If you can just... I didn't realise this. This is quite interesting. So universities used to have seats in the House of Commons, is that correct?
Indeed they did. Well, the first election where every voter had one vote and one vote only was 1950. It was the Labour government that dissolved the university seats, Cambridge, Oxford, Durham, I think, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and the University of Wales, which was until 2007 a federal institution, a bit like the University of London with its constituent colleges. The University of Wales had a seat in Parliament. 1942, the Liberal representative, the Liberal member for the University of Wales, resigns his seat to take up a public appointment. And Saunders Lewis declares himself as a candidate. He's on the fringes of his own party by now. He continues as a member, but he doesn't hold any office in the party by 1942. He, clearly in consultation with the party, declares himself as the candidate for Plaid Cymru. And it leaves the Liberals who are defending the seat in a bit of a quandary, because of course this is a wartime election. The major political parties have made an informal, I don't know, maybe you'd possibly know more about this than me, Tom, but there was certainly an understanding that the major political parties, Labour, Conservatives and Liberals, wouldn't oppose one another in by-elections while there was government of national unity. That was the reason. So it was incumbent on the Liberals to find someone to contest the seat or defend the seat against Saunders Lewis. Saunders Lewis is first out of the trap, and they simply can't find anyone because it's not clear that they're going to hold the seat. There's still this carryover from the events of 1936, 1937, when Saunders Lewis has become a famous figure after his imprisonment. There's still a sense that he is the Welsh candidate. Irrespective of party, he is a representative of Welsh identity. And the Liberal Party don't have a credible candidate to stand against him. What eventually emerges is a rather curious compromise with an old sparring partner of Saunders Lewis, a chap called William John Griffith, who was a Welsh academic in Cardiff. He'd retired by the time that Saunders Lewis took his post there in 1951. William John Griffith had been a member of Plaid Cymru and had fallen out with the party because of its declared neutrality during the war. Plaid Cymru declared that Wales should be neutral in the Second World War, and this very much upset Griffith, W.J. Griffith, William John Griffith. Griffith withdrew from Plaid Cymru, comes back onto the scene and says, I will stand for the Liberals, but I will stand as an independent Liberal. I won't accept the Liberal whip if I'm elected, but I will accept your financial support and your people to go around and canvass for me. And the Liberal Party, near enough, feels itself obliged to adopt W.J. Griffith. I think for Griffith, it's almost a matter of personal animus against Plaid Cymru because of the way it had conducted itself when war was declared. There's an awful lot of those people, of course, who were graduates of the University of Wales and therefore had a vote. An awful lot of them were involved in the war effort and weren't in Wales to cast their vote in person. However, Griffith wins the seat, he's elected, and that's the last we hear of Saunders Lewis as a practical politician.
It's quite interesting you use that term practical politician. I think if you look at his life and you look at the kind of development of Plaid Cymru under him, this failure to win a by-election, probably this is only supposition, but he probably would have never won a normal by-election. That's to say, a sort of constituency by-election. I think this particular seat, the University of Wales, must have been a real gift for him, and he still didn't manage to do it. Plaid didn't win a seat in Parliament until 1966. That was also a by-election, I think. Do you think that Lewis just simply wasn't very interested in organised politics? That's to say, he was just more interested in basically cultural pressure and organisation? Or was he interested in politics and just not organised or savvy enough to be able to convert his own quite interesting political ideas into a kind of electable, digestible political programme for the public?
Ooh, big question. I don't know. I'm going to see whether something I quote you from Saunders Lewis himself answers the question. I'm not sure whether it will. 1931, I think it was. He writes to somebody, not entirely seriously, and he says, I have 2 articles which I prepared for publication. and I can't be sure which one of them I should publish. One is called Farewell to Literature. The other is called Farewell to Politics. And I'm going to toss a coin. So I think what appears to happen is that he's seeking throughout a synthesis between culture and its political expression, but is aware at the same time that there's a dichotomy there. I use the term a practical politician and an active politician in party politics. I suspect that at heart, he realizes that none of what he's proposing is ever going to be popular. This fact that he comes out after spending time in prison and says it is the job of the leader to suffer contempt and poverty and all the rest of it is rather cutting in proper sense of the word, a pathetic figure. I think he was aware that he couldn't be electable without compromising those ideas. I think there was almost an awareness that Wales doesn't get it. Wales doesn't get me.
And he wasn't interested in compromising.
No, there was no compromise there. And I don't think there was ever, he didn't have the common touch, clearly. A little too cerebral, a little too remote, possibly too sincere in a way to not an awful lot of self-deprecation about the man. He's not. I hope I haven't given the impression that he was a dry as dust individual, because that wasn't quite what it was about him. But possibly a little more levity would not have gone amiss. There was an intensity about him.
I'm quite amused by the 2 articles story, because Boris Johnson did the same thing.
Well, yes, there's parallels there. Yeah.
If we just talk about Plaid Cymru today, Plaid is not seen as being a kind of right-wing party today. It's a social democratic, centre-left nationalist party, much like the sort of SNP is in Scotland. Yeah. Lewis clearly had very little time for socialism. And I wanted to read this quote because I thought people might find it quite interesting. He said, if we do not prevail, that's his cause, the serfs, who he's referring to communists as serfs, the serfs' chance will come. Common people without past or language or respect for tradition will take fire in their hands. From South Wales will come the apocalypse which will destroy the British Empire. Socialism and communism, as that quote illustrates, was very prominent in South Welsh coal mining, manufacturing communities throughout the 20th century, really. And one would think that if Welsh nationalism were to have ever taken off, it would have had to have gained support of some of those individuals, some people from the left.
Yeah.
But it didn't really.
It didn't. And no. I think
if I can just ask you a sort of specific question. Do you blame Lewis for the rift between nationalism and socialism, or do you think that a synthesis of those two things was always quite unlikely?
I think, well, if we turn the telescope round and look back from today, what we have at the moment is a fairly informal but clearly widely observed agreement between Plaid Cymru and Mark Drakeford's Labour Party, Labour government in Wales, that the two will cooperate, which shows that there's a strand of nationalism which can almost, if you like, adopt a class base to its politics. So I think, to answer your question, it's not impossible for there to be a left-leaning nationalism. I think we've seen it to an extent, as you said, sort of centre-left SNP, and certainly a centre-left Plaid Cymru by now. What I think held the project back was that Saunders Lewis's nationalism was always about the undoing of the present. It was always about the restoration of some lost Eden, of a Welsh-speaking and ideally a Catholic Wales, etc., etc. So it was Saunders Lewis's mission to unmake Wales as it was in his time in order to go back. I think what Plaid Cymru learned to do after Saunders Lewis was to conflate nationalism and patriotism. Saunders Lewis wasn't a patriot, because patriotism presupposes that all's well with the world, that you can wave your red dragon flag at and say, I'm proud to be Welsh. He wasn't proud to be Welsh. There's no pride or triumphalism in his Welshness. It's this state of incompleteness, as he called it. There's been a break with the past. We need to restore that. The Wales that I live in, he says, is a broken Wales. Is a Wales that's lost its better nature. And you find him very critical of Wales as it was at the time. He's not patriotic. He didn't enjoy singing "Land of My Fathers" and all the rest of it, because it struck him that Wales wasn't genuinely Wales.
So he was a reactionary, really, to the extent that he was anything.
He was, yeah. That didn't preclude wanting to improve the condition of the people, I think, but it does tend to a certain paternalism.
Yeah.
I don't think he didn't particularly want to. Yeah, he didn't want to push people about, I don't think, but by the same token, he didn't want to allow them an awful lot of what they already appeared to be enjoying, which was pubs and chips and rugby union.
Yeah.
And there's a quotation about going through the valleys where he talks about this elongated bedlam. And it's just a place where that has ceased to be what it should be.
That was going to be my sort of last or near to last question for you, actually, Robin. Was the other thing I read, the quote I read earlier was very specific about South Wales, and he sounds quite contemptuous of South Wales as it existed at the time, from what you said. I've met quite a lot of South Welsh people. My mum is Welsh, so I have South Welsh family, and I've met other South Welsh people who are often quite dismissive of the North Welsh and of nationalists in particular. Some of them simply because the North Welsh aren't very good at rugby. Mm-hmm. But the differences are there. I mean, in terms of language, the North Welsh and the people in Mid Wales speak the Welsh language a lot more than people do in the valleys. The politics is quite different, as we've discussed. South Wales is mostly urban, and North Wales is quite rural and agricultural. In terms of sport, and it's a non-trivial point that, given how important rugby union is in South Wales, it's not quite got the same resonance in the north. There's plenty of differences. I mean, do you think that even talking about Welsh nationalism and Wales as a kind of single cultural unit is perhaps a bit misleading?
Well, as important as the identification with rugby union or football maybe in the north, the fact that there's no terrifically good, well, there's no rail link. You cannot travel from North Wales to South Wales without veering off into England and back in again. You either change at Chester or you change at Birmingham, road links are almost non-existent too, of any great quality. And so I think way before there was any idea of nationalism, any sense of Welshness that happened, say, in the 18th century in the London coffee houses. And the chap Gwynalf Williams, left-wing nationalist historian, who talks about London in the 18th century as being the surrogate capital of an invertebrate nation, that there wasn't a unity about it. So I think there's something, there's almost a geographical determinism going on there, that Wales can't think of itself as a unity. And I think what you have in Plaid Cymru at present is a compromise where both the Welsh-speaking North and the English-speaking industrialised South say it might be in our interest to have the support of those people over there too. And we can work together to achieve rather different goals for ourselves. I think that's what's come out of it, and maybe Saunders Lewis didn't back enough horses, if that makes sense. Had he said we need an industrial policy and we need a cultural policy, but I think what happened was he said, okay, we need to restore a Welsh-speaking Wales, when clearly the language was losing ground apace, particularly in South Wales at the time. So I don't think he caught the zeitgeist, if you like.
Just as a final question, Robin, I'm not going to be mean and ask you if you're a Welsh nationalist yourself. I mean, you can tell us if you like, but do you think an independent Wales is likely sort of in the medium to long term? It doesn't look particularly likely short term, especially when you compare it to Scotland and Northern Ireland, but 30 or 40 years from now?
Okay, right, well, I'll declare my hand. I'm English, and I'm not a nationalist, although I have occasionally voted for Plaid Cymru when I thought that was the best candidate, if you like. Centre-left, I suppose you'd call me. As to the substantive question, I think Wales's choice will largely be dictated by what happens in England. There's currently a popular movement. How big it is yet, I'm not absolutely sure. The membership figures are quite impressive, but still rather small. It's grown rapidly, called Yes Cymru. The English yes, and Cymru, the Welsh word for Wales, Yes Cymru, which I think is almost hoping that we continue to have the type of Conservative government we've got down in Westminster. Because what's happening in Westminster is likely to make people think about the possibility of nationalism as an escape. So I think it will be more, I'm trying to work out which is push and which is pull here. It will not be the pull of Wales to come together so much as the push, the wish to flee from whatever is happening over the border. I think that's the sense of it, and clearly one eye on Scotland.
Absolutely,
certainly something that's happened post Saunders Lewis is an understanding between the SNP and Plaid that they have shared issues, and I think they form some sort of caucus in Westminster. I understand that they meet, which clearly there was no Scottish nationalist representation when Saunders Lewis was active in Plaid Cymru, nor was there, of course, for Plaid, but they didn't have any type of relationship when Saunders Lewis was at the helm. Welsh nationalism was Welsh nationalism. It didn't align itself with nationalism in any of the other Celtic countries. I think that's a development post Saunders, and that's become more and more formalised in recent years. And I understand that I think there are 3-4 Plaid Cymru members and a 50-odd SNP, and I think They meet in the tea rooms.
They do, as I
Yeah.
understand it. Yeah, I think you're correct that I think probably the worst thing for the SNP and for Plaid, just as a note to finish on, I've been thinking about this more recently. I think the worst thing for them would probably be a Labour government in Westminster because it would force them to rethink their, at least very much their anti-austerity stance or relative anti-austerity stance. Robin, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very
Okay.
much. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Where can people find your work if they want to explore Saunders Lewis more, or if they want to delve into some Welsh literature, if we have any Welsh speakers?
Okay.
Where can they go?
I suppose you could begin by Googling my writing name, which is T Robin Chapman. T for Theodore, which I never use, but it's rather useful to distinguish me from other Robin Chapmans. T Robin Chapman. And if I can do a very brief plug, May 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, bad time to bring out a book. I brought out a volume in the Oxford Literary History of Wales series, where I look at Saunders Lewis, the writer. So if you'd like to read the complement to Saunders Lewis, the politician, you'll find quite a good deal on him as a creative writer and as a critic. Thanks very much for the invitation.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released. If you're just on that last stretch of your commute to or from work, or have a spare 2 minutes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.